However, the most extreme protectionist element that was introduced, again, at the insistence of the United States and agreement of the other rich countries, is what's called intellectual property rights, which is not only highly protectionist, but is designed to prevent development and innovation, to ensure that the technology of the future in pharmaceuticals, software, etc., will remain in the hands of the huge publicly subsidized corporate systems of the West, primarily the U.S., but others too, instead of being freely available. And various measures were introduced to which are, as I say, not only highly protectionist, but designed to prevent growth and development. So, for example, the institution of what are called product patents instead of process patents is quite significant. That means that if, say, Merck Pharmaceutical develops some technique to produce a drug, under process, you could, under the earlier regime, patent the process. But if somebody figured out a smarter way to make it, you couldn't patent the product. They could make it that smarter way. Suppose, say, in India or Brazil or somewhere, they figured out a cheaper way to make it, they could do it. Now that's blocked too, in an effort to prevent progress and development, but to increase profits through protectionist measures. This is now having a big issue, primarily because of things like, the AIDS epidemic in Africa, the spread of malaria and other things. All the drugs are priced out of sight because they're not being sold at market prices. They're being sold at...
That in fact, government policy really has worked if you begin to think about for whom is that policy directed.
The other crucial aspect of the Uruguay round is that it extends further something which has been going on for some time, and that is the transfer of rights, all rights, in fact, away from people and into the hands of corporate entities. So early in this century, corporations were, by judicial activism, granted, not legislation, granted the rights of persons. So they became persons. Of course, they're not persons. They're collectivist entities. They're actually private tyrannies is what they amount to. But they were given the rights of persons. It's a great attack on classical liberalism, on the theory that rights inhere in people. But now these new arrangements extend that. So under the World Trade Organization rules, and not only them, corporations have rights way beyond people. For example, you and I don't have the right to, say, sue Canada if Canada is doing something we don't like. But the Ethel Corporation has the right to sue Canada if Canada's blocking distribution of some probably carcinogenic additive that they're producing. And
what this amendment says is that we believe in democracy, and we believe that legislation passed at the local level, at the state level, and here in the United States Congress should not be overridden by the World Trade Organization. And while we may disagree about this piece of legislation or that piece of legislation, we think that there is something very wrong about our trade policy, whereby this government has abdicated enormous responsibility, and whereby major environmental legislation, legislation dealing with human rights, and other important issues is now threatened and has been threatened by the World Trade Organization. We believe that there is something very wrong when the state of Massachusetts, for example...
The gentleman will suspend. Will the House come to order so the gentleman from Vermont can be heard? He's doing well, but so he can be heard. Gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you very much. We think that there is something wrong when important environmental legislation passed by this Congress is overridden by people in Geneva who meet behind closed doors. We think there's something wrong when legislation passed in the state of Vermont, state of Massachusetts, designed to bring back democracy in Burma is threatened by the World Trade Organization. Let me take a moment now to yield for 1 minute to my friend from Florida, Mr. Stearns, who has been very active in this issue.
I want to thank my colleague from Vermont, and I want to thank my colleague from Arizona for his kindness and letting at least just talk about it briefly here. Basically, what we're trying to do is give the U.S. Trade Representative more money so he can investigate, look at the U.S. laws, both local and state, that are impacted by the World Trade Organization when it makes decisions, and do they override actually in effect some of these laws at the local and state level. As you know, Mr. Chairman, President Clinton has, since he's taken office, they've negotiated more than 200 trade agreements. And of these 200 trade agreements, only 2 of them have had fast track. This certainly deflates the administration's claim that our nation is in dire need of fast track. So I think the important point here is this amendment that Mr. Sanders from Vermont is offering, and others, including myself, will allow the U.S. Trade Representative to have additional resources to study the impact of the World Trade Organization on the laws, the sovereign laws in the state and the local level, and to get back to Congress to see what impact these trade negotiations are having. And I yield back to Mr. Sanders.
I yield to Mr. Frank.
I thank the gentleman. It would seem to me if the chairman of the Rules Committee can object to himself, the gentleman from Vermont should be allowed to be flexible in yielding. I would simply note that the state that I represent passed legislation which said that the state did not wish to do business with people who supported the terribly repressive regime in Burma. And we have since that time had international efforts to stop the state of Massachusetts from deciding how to spend its own dollars in purchases. And that is why I support the effort of the gentleman from Vermont. If we are going to have people use these international bodies to object because we object to oppression, then the time has come to fight back.